There's a neighborhood in North St. Louis where children no longer play in the dirt, not because their parents forbid it, but because the soil itself is dangerous. The company that made it that way has been gone for years. The chemicals it left behind have not. This is the story of Monsanto, a corporation that spent a century poisoning America, documenting the damage and deciding the profits were worth it. John Francis Queeny was not supposed to build an empire. He was born in Chicago in 1859, the son of Irish immigrants who had fled the famine. His father died before John turned 7. His mother took in laundry to keep the family alive. There was no money for high school at 14. He was sweeping floors at a pharmaceutical supply house, learning the chemical trade one errand at a time. What people noticed about Queeny was not intelligence, it was stubbornness, a capacity for single-minded pursuit. That could look like obsession when he fixed on something he did not stop by. His mid-30s, he had worked his way to purchasing agent at Meyer Brothers Drug Company in St. Louis. He had married Olga Monsanto, daughter of a Spanish sugar merchant. He had a respectable position, a stable income, a comfortable life. He threw it away voluntarily. The opportunity he saw was specific. At the turn of the 20th century, virtually all saccharin sold in America was imported from Germany. The German chemical companies that produced it held a monopoly. American buyers paid whatever price was set on whatever terms were demanded. There was no alternative. Queeny decided he would become the alternative. There was one significant obstacle. He had no idea how to manufacture saccharin. The chemical process had been discovered in 1879 at Johns Hopkins University, but the industrial manufacturing method was closely guarded. German companies had perfected it over decades and had no interest in sharing. Queeny would have to reverse engineer it from scratch. His wife's family thought he had lost his mind, an untrained amateur competing against established European chemical giants. With nothing but stubbornness and $5,000 in savings, in November 1901, he rented space in a warehouse on the south side of St. Louis, hired a chemist who claimed to know the process, and began. The chemist knew less than advertised. The first batches were contaminated. The fumes were toxic. Everything they touched turned black. From the coal tar distillation, workers suffered chemical burns and respiratory problems from the first week. Queeny kept going. By early 1902, after months of failure, they produced a batch pure enough to sell. He walked into the offices of a young Atlanta beverage company called Coca-Cola and made a simple pitch: domestic saccharin cheaper than German imports, guaranteed supply. Coca-Cola placed a trial order, then a larger one. Within 5 years, Monsanto Chemical Works controlled 85% of American saccharin production. The German monopoly was broken. The margins were extraordinary. Saccharin cost pennies per pound to produce and sold for dollars. Queeny had learned something that would shape everything that followed. There was exceptional profit in chemicals that nobody else wanted to make, especially when the manufacturing process was difficult, dangerous, or genuinely unpleasant. World War I transformed the company. When the war severed American access to German chemical imports, entire industries found themselves without essential materials overnight. Queeny moved fast. In 1915, Monsanto began producing phenol for explosives. Manufacturing in 1917, they started making aspirin, previously a German monopoly. In 1918, they were producing sulfuric acid. Revenue in 1915 was $438,000. Revenue in 1918 was $3.6 million. The company had grown eightfold in 3 years, driven entirely by wartime demand and the collapse of European competition. The rapid expansion created incentives that would define the company's culture for the next century. Safety became secondary to production volume. Environmental considerations did not yet exist as a meaningful category. Workers who got hurt were replaced. The only question that mattered was whether a product could be made and sold profitably. Monsanto could always answer yes. Queeny died in 1933, leaving the company to his son Edgar, where John Francis had been a scrappy entrepreneur betting everything on a single obsession. Edgar was a corporate builder with continental ambitions. He had a chemistry degree from Cornell. He understood the science in ways his father never had. He also inherited his father's willingness to treat other people's health as an acceptable cost of doing business. In 1935, Edgar made the decision that would define Monsanto for The next half-century, he decided the company would manufacture polychlorinated biphenyls PCBs. Seemed like an industrial miracle. They were chemically stable under almost any conditions. They did not burn, they did not conduct electricity, they were ideal for use in electrical transformers, hydraulic systems, and industrial heat transfer equipment. Manufacturers across every major industry wanted them. Immediately by 1937, Monsanto's plant in East St. Louis was producing PCBs under the brand name Aeroclear. Within a decade, the company controlled approximately half of global PCB production. The profit margins exceeded even saccharin. The production process involved chlorinating biphenyl, a hydrocarbon derived from coal tar, in large reactors at high temperatures. The higher the chlorine content, the more stable the compound, and the more toxic. Here's what Monsanto knew in 1937. The same year commercial production began, their own internal research showed that PCBs caused severe health problems in exposed workers. Company documents from that period describe workers developing chloroquine, a disfiguring skin condition caused by chemical exposure. Several developed serious liver damage, some died. The company's response was not to stop production, it was to establish what they called maximum allowable concentrations and install ventilation systems that, in theory, would keep worker exposure below dangerous thresholds. In practice, the systems were inadequate. Production continued. By 1949, Monsanto held a secret meeting with other PCB manufacturers to discuss the mounting evidence of harm. The meeting minutes, uncovered decades later during litigation, are specific and chilling. The participants knew PCBs accumulated in human tissue and did not break down. They knew workers were getting sick. They knew the chemicals were spreading through the environment in ways that could not be recalled. They decided to keep producing. The market was generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. No one in that room was prepared to walk away from it. The workers themselves often did not know what they were being exposed to. Monsanto did not label the chemicals clearly. Safety training was minimal. Protective equipment consisted of cloth gloves and basic respirators that did not filter PCB vapor effectively. The jobs paid well, better than most alternatives available to working-class people in St. Louis. In the 1940s and 1950s, many workers were black men and women from the surrounding neighborhoods who had migrated from the rural South, looking for industrial wages. The plant had become the economic foundation of entire communities. When people began getting sick, leaving was not a realistic option. Where would they go? What would they do instead? The plant had made itself too essential to fight, even as it was slowly poisoning the people who depended on it. Workers ate lunch with contaminated hands. They brought chemicals home on their work clothes, exposing their children and spouses. Year after year, the PCBs accumulated in their bodies in amounts that would not become visible as cancer or organ failure for decades. While the PCB contamination spread through North St. Louis, a different catastrophe was being manufactured in Monsanto's agricultural division. In the 1950s, the company began expanding into herbicides and agricultural chemicals. American farming was industrializing rapidly, and chemical inputs were seen as essential to the unlimited productivity that post-war optimism demanded. In 1955, Monsanto registered a herbicide called 24,5-T, effective at killing broadleaf plants while leaving grasses intact, useful for clearing roadsides and maintaining power line corridors. When combined with another herbicide called 2,4-D, the mixture became significantly more potent. The United States military noticed they were looking for something that could strip jungle canopy in Southeast Asia, eliminating cover for guerrilla forces. Monsanto's herbicide mixture, they concluded, could remove the foliage from entire forests. In 1961, the first large military order was placed. The herbicide would be shipped in barrels with orange identification stripes. Soldiers who sprayed it would come to call it Agent Orange. The military contracts transformed Monsanto's agricultural division. Revenue doubled, then tripled. New production facilities were constructed specifically for military herbicide production. The St. Louis plant expanded again. Here's what Monsanto knew about 2,4,5-T when manufactured at high temperatures, which is what large-scale military production required. A byproduct forms in the reaction. That byproduct is called 137. A-tetrachlorodibenzopdioxin TCDD. It is one of the most toxic substances ever. Systematically studied, TCDD causes cancer, birth defects, immune system damage, and endocrine disruption at concentrations measured in parts per trillion. 1 part per trillion is equivalent to 1 drop of water in an Olympic swimming pool. At those infinitesimal concentrations, the compound causes measurable biological harm. Monsanto's own chemists had identified TCDD contamination in the manufacturing process before production scaled up. The internal documentation was clear. They knew what was in the barrels. They kept shipping. The company's accelerated production methods, designed to meet expanding military demand, created TCDD contamination levels in Monsanto's Agent Orange that were sometimes 10 to 50 times higher than the output of other manufacturers who produced the same herbicide more carefully. The difference was temperature. Monsanto ran their reactors hotter and faster than recommended. More output per reactor per hour, more TCDD per gallon of herbicide, more profit per contract, more poison per barrel. In March 1965, a reactor at Monsanto's plant in Nitro, West Virginia, used to produce 24,5-T exploded during operation, releasing a cloud of TCDD-contaminated steam across the facility. Workers were covered in the chemical immediately. Within days, severe chloroquine appeared across their body's liver. Problems followed. The contamination spread through the plant and into the surrounding community. Monsanto shut down the reactor for emergency cleanup. They resumed production within weeks. The Vietnam War was escalating. The military was increasing its herbicide orders. The contracts were too valuable to lose to an accident between 1965 and 1970. While Monsanto's public position remained that their products were safe when handled properly, workers at Nitro and at the St. Louis facilities were loading TCDD-contaminated herbicide into barrels with cloth gloves and inadequate respirators, breathing air that their employers knew was poison, trusting that if there were serious dangers they would have been told. That trust was betrayed deliberately, and the record proving it was filed in their own archives. By 1970, the evidence of widespread harm had become impossible to contain internally. Vietnam veterans were returning with illnesses that military physicians had not seen before: soft tissue sarcomas, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, peripheral neuropathy. Rare cancers appearing in young men who had been healthy when they deployed. Their children were being born with severe birth defects at rates that alarmed the doctors who delivered them. In February 1970, a Swedish research team published findings showing that 2,4,5-T caused birth defects in laboratory animals at doses far below what American soldiers in Vietnam had been exposed to. The study was rigorous. The conclusions were unambiguous. The U.S. government suspended domestic use of 2,4,5-T in April 1970. Military spraying in Vietnam continued until 1971. Monsanto's response to the mounting evidence was to commission its own research. Their scientists conducted legitimate toxicological studies. Those studies confirmed the Swedish findings. TCDD caused severe biological harm at extremely low exposures. Monsanto did not publish the results. Internal memos from this period, eventually revealed through litigation, show executives discussing whether disclosure would hurt sales and expose the company to liability. The concern was not whether the risks were real. Their own research had confirmed they were. The concern was money. While those memos were being written, veterans were filing into VA hospitals with cancers their doctors could not explain. Workers at the Nitro plant were developing lymphomas in their 50s. Children were being born near the St. Louis facility with neural tube defects and cardiac malformations at rates that neighborhood physicians found deeply troubling. Monsanto's public position remained unchanged. The products were safe when used properly. The contamination Monsanto created was not limited to the bodies of workers and veterans. For 40 years, from 1937 through the late 1970s, PCB waste from the St. Louis plant had been disposed of in ways that would have been criminal under any reasonable standard. Some was discharged directly into the Mississippi River, some was buried in unlined pits on company property, some was sold to waste haulers who spread it across landfills and quarries throughout Missouri. In 1971, a waste hauler contracted by Monsanto and several other chemical companies sprayed oil contaminated with dioxin on the dirt roads of Times Beach, Missouri, a small town of about 2,000 people southwest of St. Louis, to control dust. The contamination was so severe that in 1983, after floodwaters spread the toxic oil across the entire community, the federal government purchased every property in Times Beach, relocated every resident, and demolished every structure and entire American town erased because a chemical company found it convenient to dump its waste on roads. Back at the St. Louis plant, soil testing conducted in the 1980s revealed PCB contamination at levels thousands of times higher than current safety thresholds. Groundwater beneath the facility had been contaminated for decades. The creek running alongside the property had been functioning as an open chemical sewer, flowing toward the Mississippi. Fish caught near the plant were unsafe to eat. The EPA eventually issued consumption advisories, but many families in the surrounding neighborhoods who relied on fishing from the river as a food source had been eating contaminated fish for years before any warning was issued in the neighborhoods adjacent to the plant. Families had grown vegetable gardens in contaminated soil. Children had played in contaminated dirt for decades. None of it was visible. None of it could be smelled or tasted. All of it was accumulating. The lawsuits began slowly in the late 1970s. Vietnam veterans filed claims describing cancers and nerve damage, and children born with severe disabilities. Monsanto and the other chemical manufacturers contested every case. Their legal strategy was specific and effective. In the short term, they demanded that each individual plaintiff prove not just exposure, not just that Agent Orange could cause their illness, but that Agent Orange definitively caused their specific illness, rather than any other possible factor. This is nearly impossible to prove in toxic tort litigation. The causal chain from chemical exposure to individual cancer is never a straight line that any jury can follow. Without doubt, Monsanto's lawyers exploited this uncertainty systematically for years. Meanwhile, the science accumulated by the 1990s, thousands of peer-reviewed studies had established links between PCB exposure and multiple forms of cancer, between TCDD exposure and an extensive list of serious health conditions. The epidemiological evidence was overwhelming. In 1996, the EPA classified PCBs as probable human carcinogens. In 2009, they upgraded that classification to carcinogenic to humans. No qualifiers, no remaining scientific uncertainty. The company that had been arguing for 60 years that the evidence was incomplete now faced regulatory consensus that the evidence was definitive. In 1984, the first major settlement arrived. Monsanto and 6 other chemical manufacturers agreed to pay $180 million to resolve Agent Orange claims from Vietnam veterans. The payment worked out to approximately $12.00 per veteran, a sum that bore no relationship to the actual costs of cancer treatment, lost income, or the disability of children born with dioxin-related birth defects. But it established that the manufacturers could be held liable. More lawsuits followed, each one chipping further at Monsanto's defenses. By the 2000s, Monsanto had repositioned itself publicly as an agricultural biotechnology company. They had developed genetically modified crops resistant to their Roundup herbicide. They had acquired seed companies and built a significant position in global agriculture. The old industrial chemical business, the PCBs, the dioxin, the contaminated sites across Missouri, had been formally transferred to a spin-off company called Solutia. The corporate restructuring was deliberate, an attempt to separate the profitable agricultural business from the accumulated liability of the previous century. Solutia inherited the old plants, the contaminated land, and the bulk of the legal exposure. Monsanto kept the seeds, the herbicides, and the brand for a time. It appeared the strategy might work. In 2018, Bayer AG acquired Monsanto for $63 billion, one of the largest corporate acquisitions in pharmaceutical and agricultural industry history. Bayer wanted the seed technology, the agricultural market position, the intellectual property portfolio. Their due diligence had focused primarily on Roundup litigation. The tens of thousands of lawsuits from people claiming the herbicide had caused their non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Bayer knew this was a risk and decided it was manageable. What they apparently failed to grasp was the scale and persistence of the older liabilities. The PCB cases, the Agent Orange cases, the contamination claims from communities surrounding former plant sites that had never been fully resolved and were not going to resolve quietly within months of the acquisition closing. Juries began returning massive verdicts. In August 2018, a California jury awarded $189 million to a school groundskeeper who said Roundup had caused his lymphoma. In March 2019, another jury awarded $80 million in a similar case. The decisions multiplied. By 2020, Bayer faced more than 125 lawsuits related to Monsanto's products. The company's stock price declined by nearly half from its pre-acquisition peak. Executives publicly stated they had underestimated the legal exposure when they negotiated the purchase. In June 2020, Bayer announced a settlement framework of between $10 billion and $11 billion to resolve the Roundup litigation. The PCB cases continued. The Agent Orange cases continued. New plaintiffs kept coming forward. Workers from old chemical plants now in their 70s and 80s, residents of contaminated neighborhoods, veterans whose cancers had only recently been formally linked to their Vietnam-era exposure. By 2023, Bayer had set aside more than $16 billion for Monsanto-related litigation. The company's market value had fallen by nearly 50% since the acquisition. Werner Baumann, the CEO who had championed the deal, announced he would step down. Early shareholders called it the worst corporate acquisition in modern history. Consider what $16 billion actually represents in human terms. Consider James Watts, who worked at the Monsanto plant in St. Louis from 1957 to 1982. He started in the PCB production unit, loading and unloading barrels. The pay was excellent, $18 an hour. By the late 1970s, exceptional wages for a man without a college degree. He bought a house 3 blocks from the plant, raised 4 children, sent 2 of them to college. He believed he was building something. In 1998, at 62, he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. His doctors asked about chemical exposures. He described his decades at Monsanto. They nodded. They had seen the pattern before. He went through chemotherapy. The cancer went into remission, then returned. More treatment, another remission. In 2004, his liver began failing. His physicians suspected decades of PCB exposure had damaged it beyond its capacity to recover. He died in 2007 from liver failure secondary to his lymphoma treatment. He was 71 years old. His widow filed a lawsuit. Monsanto fought it for 3 years, arguing that his cancer could have had other causes, that specific causation from PCB exposure was unprovable in his individual case. The case settled for $340 after legal fees. Mrs. Watts received approximately $220 that is what Monsanto paid for a man's life for the deliberate concealment of risks. He had a right to know. For 40 years of exposure, he never consented to multiply that story by tens of thousands, each one. A person who trusted their employer, who believed that if the work were truly dangerous, they would have been warned, who suffered consequences they never chose and could never undo. The Monsanto plant on the north side of St. Louis was demolished in 2020. The site is now a federal Superfund cleanup zone, meaning it is contaminated severely enough that the government has assumed control of remediation. Estimated cleanup cost between $800 million and $1.2 billion. Estimated timeline: decades. Some areas may never achieve full remediation. The contamination is too deep, too widespread. To chemically persistent PCBs do not break down on human timescales. Their half-life in certain soil and sediment environments is measured in decades, sometimes longer. Contamination from production that ceased in the 1970s will still be present in the soil in the 2070s. The decisions made in East St. Louis boardrooms in the 1940s will still be causing measurable environmental harm long after everyone who made them is gone. In Vietnamese communities, both in the United States and in Vietnam itself, the accounting is even more unresolved. Agent Orange spraying ended in 1971. The dioxin remained in the soil, accumulated in the food chain, and continued causing biological harm in the populations exposed to it. For decades afterward, an estimated 3 million Vietnamese people were exposed. During the spraying program, approximately 400 0 were killed or permanently injured. An estimated 500,000 children were born with dioxin-related birth defects. Vietnamese victims have received essentially no compensation from Monsanto or from the United States government. The manufacturers successfully argued in American courts that as government contractors, following military specifications, they were shielded from civil liability to foreign nationals. American veterans received inadequate settlements. American workers received some compensation after prolonged legal battles. The Vietnamese civilians, who bore the most concentrated exposure, received nothing. The lessons embedded in this story are not complicated when a company knows it is causing serious harm to human beings and continues because the profits justify it. Eventually, that harm returns not as moral judgment, not as karma, but as physical reality. The chemicals do not disappear when the profits have been collected. The cancers do not stop because the contracts have been fulfilled. The contamination does not forgive. Corporate restructuring or changes in ownership. Bayer paid $63 billion for Monsanto in 2018, believing they were acquiring an agricultural technology company with some manageable legacy legal issues. What they actually acquired was accountability for a century of decisions that had poisoned soil and water and human bodies in ways that no settlement can fully remediate and no corporate transaction can undo. The Monsanto plant is rubble now, cleaned up and hauled away at enormous public expense. But in the neighborhoods that surrounded it, the contamination persists. In the soil, in the groundwater, in the bodies of people who worked there, in the bodies of people who lived nearby, and the bodies of people who ate fish from the river in Vietnam. The dioxin is still measurable in the food chain, still accumulating in the tissue of people who were not yet born when the last barrel of Agent Orange was sprayed. John Francis Queeny died wealthy and respected in 1933, before the worst consequences of what he had built had begun to unfold. The executives who decided in 1949 to keep manufacturing PCBs despite their own evidence of harm are long dead. The executives who chose to run the reactors hotter to produce more Agent Orange faster are gone. The poison they chose to create is still here. Some industrial decisions echo across generations. Some harms once made cannot be unmade, and some legacies persist long after the company that created them has ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. The ruins of what Monsanto chose to do are not just the demolished buildings on the north side of St. Louis. They are in the soil, they are in the water table, they are in the bodies of people who never made a single decision about chemical production, who never signed a contract or collected a dividend, who simply had the misfortune of living downstream. That is what a century of choosing profit over human life looks like, not in the language of corporate governance or environmental regulation, but in concrete physical reality. MEASURED in parts per billion in groundwater samples counted in cancer diagnoses and calculated in legal settlements that can never make anyone whole. There's a document that Monsanto lawyers spent decades trying to keep out of courtrooms. It was written in 1969 by a company scientist named W.B. Papa George. The subject line read, "Problem with PCBs." The contents were clinical and precise. Papa George had reviewed the available toxicological data on polychlorinated biphenyls. He concluded that the evidence for serious human health effects was overwhelming. He recommended the company begin planning an orderly exit from PCB production. He outlined a timeline. He described the reputational and legal risks of continued manufacturing. The memo was read by senior executives, filed, and ignored. Production of PCBs continued for another 7 years. That document became Exhibit Number 1. In dozens of lawsuits, it proved beyond any reasonable argument that Monsanto did not simply fail to understand the risk, they understood it precisely. They chose profit anyway. Consider what was happening in the neighborhoods around the plant. During those 7 years, Dorothy Baker moved her family to a house on Angelica Street in North St. Louis in 1971, 3 blocks from the Monsanto facility. She had no idea what the plant manufactured. She knew it was a chemical company. She knew the jobs paid well. She planted a vegetable garden in the backyard. The first spring tomatoes and green beans and collard greens. Her children played in that garden every summer for 8 years. In 1989, the EPA conducted soil testing throughout the neighborhood. The results in Dorothy's backyard showed PCB concentrations at 47 times the level considered safe for residential areas. Her tomatoes had been growing in what was effectively a hazardous waste site. Her children had been eating vegetables grown in contaminated soil for 8 years. Nobody had told her, nobody had warned the neighborhood. Nobody from Monsanto had knocked on a single door of the company's position. When lawsuits came was consistent and precise. They had met all applicable regulatory standards. At the time, the science had not yet established the harm. They were not responsible for what was not yet known to be harmful, except that the 1969 Papa George memo existed, and dozens of documents like it existed, and they proved that what was not yet publicly known was already privately known inside the company for decades. The gap between what Monsanto told the public and what Monsanto told itself is the entire story. Monsanto's political influence during this period deserves its own accounting. The company spent decades cultivating relationships with federal regulators and elected officials. When the EPA began considering restrictions on PCBs in the early 1970s, Monsanto did not wait to see what the agency would decide. They engaged immediately and aggressively. Former government officials were hired as lobbyists. Academic researchers were funded to produce studies with favorable conclusions. Industry coalitions were organized to present a unified front against regulation. Congressional representatives from Missouri and Illinois, whose districts contained Monsanto facilities and whose constituents depended on Monsanto employment, received targeted political support. The message delivered to regulators was consistent and carefully constructed. The science on PCBs was incomplete. The evidence of harm was not definitive. Acting prematurely would destroy American industrial jobs and hand competitive advantage to foreign manufacturers who faced no such restrictions. Every one of these arguments was made by people who had access to Monsanto's internal research, people who had read the 1949 meeting minutes, who knew what the company's own scientists had concluded about PCB toxicity, who understood that the science was not incomplete at all. It was complete, it was simply inconvenient. The lobbying operation bought 6 years of continued production between when the EPA began serious consideration of restrictions and when the Toxic Substances Control Act finally banned PCB manufacture in 1976. 6 years at the production rates Monsanto was running in the early 1970s. That gap represented hundreds of millions of pounds of additional PCBs introduced into transformers, hydraulic systems, industrial equipment, and eventually into soil and water and fish and human bodies across the United States and around the world. The ban came. Monsanto had produced PCBs for 39 years. The profits were never recovered. The contamination was not recalled. It stayed exactly where it had been deposited and began the long process of moving through the environment. That is still not finished today. The Anison chapter of this story is the most thoroughly documented because Anison produced the most damning internal documents, and because the community that brought the lawsuit was large enough and organized enough to pursue it to a verdict. Monsanto began operating a chemical plant in Anison, Alabama in 1929. The plant sat on the western edge of the city, adjacent to the predominantly black neighborhoods of West Anison, separated from residential streets by distances that would have been considered inadequate even by the standards of the era. PCB production at Anison began in the 1930s and continued for decades. The waste disposal methods used at Anison were documented in the company's own records. PCB contaminated oil was discharged into Snow Creek, a waterway that ran from the plant property through the neighborhood before draining into Chocoloco Creek and eventually into a reservoir that supplied drinking water to parts of the county. The discharges were not accidental overflows, they were routine, regular disposal of production waste into a waterway that ran through a residential neighborhood, that children swam in, that families fished in, that people used. The 1966 documents describing dead fish thrown into Snow Creek by company employees as an informal toxicity test and observed to die within 10 seconds are among the most cited in the entire history of environmental litigation. Not because the observation was scientifically sophisticated. It wasn't, but because of what it reveals about the culture inside the company. An employee watched fish die Within 10 seconds of contact with the water, wrote it down in a company document, and went back to work. There was no emergency meeting, no halt to discharges, no warning to the neighborhood. The fish dying in 10 seconds was a data point, not a crisis. The people of West Anniston did not know what was in Snow Creek. They knew the water sometimes smelled strange. They knew the fish tasted different than fish from other places. Some families stopped fishing there. Most continued. They had been fishing in that creek for generations. They had no reason to believe a company had been turning it into a chemical sewer for 30 years. Without telling anyone, the blood testing conducted as part of the eventual litigation revealed PCB concentrations in Anniston residents that were among the highest ever measured in human beings outside of direct occupational exposure. Some individuals had blood PCB levels 300 times the national average. Children who had grown up swimming in Snow Creek, adults who had eaten fish from it for decades, had absorbed quantities of polychlorinated biphenyls that no regulatory standard anywhere in the world would consider acceptable for a single day of exposure, let alone a lifetime of it. The settlement in 2003, $700 million, divided among nearly 20,000 plaintiffs, was at the time one of the largest environmental contamination settlements in American history. The average individual payment after legal fees was approximately $9.00 for a lifetime of exposure for blood PCB levels 300 times normal for the cancers and immune disorders and developmental problems that had accumulated in bodies that had been used as an unintentional repository for a chemical company's production waste. $9,000. There is a document in the Anniston litigation record that receives less attention than the dead fish memo, but that in some ways tells the more complete story. It is a 1970 internal memo discussing community relations strategy for the Anniston facility. The memo acknowledges that residents near the plant have begun asking questions about the smell from the creek, about the fish, about health problems in the neighborhood. The recommended response, documented in writing by a Monsanto communications official, was to provide reassurance without providing information, to tell concerned residents that the company took safety seriously without telling them what was actually in the water, to express openness to dialogue while ensuring that dialogue would not include disclosure of the contamination data. The memo used the phrase "manage community concerns" as if concern itself were the problem, rather than the contamination that had produced it. The people of West Anniston were not managed. They were contaminated for another 30 years. After that memo was written, before a lawsuit finally forced the disclosure that the reassurances had been designed to prevent the Agent Orange domestic testing program, is a chapter of this history that remains partially classified and almost entirely unknown to the American public. Between 1962 and 1964, before Operation Ranch Hand began, large-scale defoliation in Vietnam, the United States military conducted trials of herbicide defoliants at multiple domestic sites. The most documented of these is at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida, where testing of Agent Orange and related compounds was conducted on several thousand acres of forest and scrubland service. Members assigned to the tests were not told what they were being exposed to. They were told they were participating in training exercises or in testing of agricultural chemicals for use in food production programs. Several hundred veterans who were present at Eglin during the test period have since developed soft tissue sarcomas, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and other cancers associated with dioxin exposure at rates significantly elevated above the general veteran population. Their claims for service-connected disability have been denied by the VA at higher rates than claims from Vietnam veterans, because their exposure was never formally acknowledged in service records, because the testing program was classified, because the documentation that would establish the connection between their presence at Eglin and their subsequent cancers has taken decades to partially declassify and remains incomplete. Monsanto supplied the herbicides used in the Eglin tests. The procurement records establishing this connection were identified by researchers working through military contracting archives in the 1990s and have been used in several veterans' benefits appeals with mixed success. The veterans who were exposed at Eglin and at the other domestic test sites are now in their 80s. Many have died waiting for recognition. Their families continue the A PPEALS process in some cases into the third generation of effort against a bureaucratic system that has every institutional incentive to maintain the position that the exposure did not occur or cannot be definitively linked to the diseases it produced. Monsanto supplied the chemicals, the government conducted the tests, and then classified the records. The veterans absorbed the contamination and then spent the rest of their lives trying to prove it happened. The Roundup litigation represents the final chapter in a story that began with saccharin in 1901 and runs in a continuous line through PCBs, through Agent Orange, through glyphosate, through every product. Where the pattern repeated itself, discover a profitable chemical, produce it at scale, suppress inconvenient safety research, lobby against regulation, and continue until the lawsuits become too expensive to fight. Glyphosate was discovered by Monsanto chemist John Franz in 1970. He was not looking for a herbicide, he was studying compounds that might act as water softeners. He noticed that one compound killed plants and realized its agricultural potential. Franz spent the next several years developing glyphosate into a commercial product that would eventually be sold under the brand name Roundup. He believed genuinely that he was developing something beneficial, a herbicide that broke down more rapidly in the environment than the compounds it was designed to replace, and that would reduce agriculture's dependence on more acutely toxic chemicals. He was not wrong about the comparison. The pre-Roundup herbicide landscape included compounds that caused immediate and severe health effects at low exposure levels. Glyphosate's acute toxicity is genuinely lower than many of its predecessors. What Franz could not have known in 1974, and what Monsanto's internal research would eventually suggest, was that chronic low-level exposure to glyphosate over the years and decades that agricultural workers accumulate might produce cancer risks that the acute toxicity profile did not predict. The company's response to this emerging evidence followed the pattern established over the preceding 40 years, with mechanical precision studies raising concerns. Were not published. Researchers whose findings were inconvenient were targeted for discrediting regulatory submissions, contained the favorable data and omitted the unfavorable. The Monsanto Papers, a collection of internal documents released through litigation discovery in 2017, revealed the specific operational details of this suppression. Emails between company scientists and marketing executives discussing which studies to submit to regulators and which to withhold communications about. Ghostwriting academic papers presenting findings favorable to glyphosate under the names of independent researchers who had agreed to lend their credentials to conclusions. The company's own scientists had drafted internal assessments of the International Agency for Research on Cancer before that body classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic, in which company officials discussed strategy for challenging the classification. Before it had been publicly announced, the documents described a company that had systematized scientific fraud not as a conspiracy requiring secrecy, but as a standard operating procedure integrated into normal business processes, reviewed by legal and regulatory affairs, approved by management, and repeated across multiple product lines over multiple decades, with full institutional awareness of what was being done and why. Dwayne Johnson was 40 years old when he began using Roundup in his work as a groundskeeper for the Benicia Unified School District in the San Francisco Bay Area. He applied it to school grounds, to athletic fields, to the areas around buildings, following the product instructions, wearing the protective equipment that Monsanto's labeling indicated was sufficient for safe handling. In 2014, he was diagnosed with mycosis fungoides, a rare and aggressive form of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. His oncologist reviewed his occupational history and told him that his pattern of exposure was consistent with the exposure profiles in the epidemiological studies linking glyphosate to his type of cancer. He was told he had 2 years to live. He had 2 children. He decided to spend some of what might be his remaining time in a courtroom in San Francisco presenting the case that Monsanto had known about this risk, had suppressed the evidence, and had failed to warn him. The trial lasted for weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They awarded Johnson $189 million, including $150 million in punitive damages, reflecting their finding that Monsanto had acted with malice. The judge reduced the total to $78 million on appeal. Johnson was alive to hear the verdict. He died in 2020, before the final resolution of all the related litigation. His case opened a door that could not be closed. The verdicts that followed arrived faster than Monsanto's legal team or Bayer's acquisition analysts had modeled as a realistic scenario. Alva and Alberta Pilliot, a California couple, both diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after decades of using Roundup on their property, were awarded to $55 billion by a jury in May 2019. The award was reduced substantially on appeal, but the scale of the original verdict communicated something about how juries were responding to the evidence of what the company had known and chosen not to disclose. By the end of 2020, Bayer faced more than 125,000 active Roundup lawsuits. The company's market capitalization had fallen by more than $35 billion. Since the acquisition closed, Werner Baumann, the CEO who had championed the deal, announced he would not seek renewal of his contract. Analysts who had described the acquisition as a transformative strategic move in 2018 were using the word catastrophic in 2020. Without qualification, the cleanup of the North St. Louis Superfund site has proceeded with the particular combination of technical complexity, bureaucratic slowness, and inadequate resources that characterizes federal environmental remediation. Contractors in white hazmat suits have worked through residential streets, removing contaminated soil from front yards and backyards, replacing it with clean fill, and moving to the next property. The process is expensive. It costs more per property than most of the properties are worth. The residents who have watched it happen have experienced a specific and disorienting combination of relief and rage. Relief that something is finally being done, rage that it took until now, that it took decades of lawsuits and regulatory pressure to produce. Action that should have happened when the contamination was being created. Some of the contamination that soil removal cannot address remains in place, declared acceptable at its current reduced concentration under standards that were themselves set through a negotiation between federal regulators and the companies responsible for the contamination. The groundwater beneath the site, which has absorbed decades of PCB migration, requires a different remediation approach. Pump and treat systems that extract contaminated water, filter it, and reinfuse it on a timeline that engineers estimate at 30 to 50 years for the aquifer to reach acceptable contamination levels. Not clean, acceptable. The distinction is not semantic. Clean means the contamination is gone. Acceptable means the contamination is present at levels that regulatory models suggest will not cause measurable harm to a hypothetical average person with hypothetical average exposure. The people who actually live there, who are not hypothetical, who have already been exposed for decades, did not receive a contamination profile calibrated to acceptable levels. They received whatever the plant discharged for 40 years before anyone was measuring. The community garden established by residents of North St. Louis in 1995 on a vacant lot 3 blocks from the former plant site was an act of exactly the kind of community self-improvement that urban planners and public health advocates consistently recommend to low-income neighborhoods. Grow your own food, strengthen community bonds, reclaim abandoned land for productive use, improve nutrition, build resilience. The people who established it followed this advice. They grew tomatoes and collard greens and sweet potatoes. They built a small greenhouse. For seedlings, they organized community workdays. They brought their children for 15 years. The garden was one of the most active community spaces in the neighborhood. In 2010, soil testing, conducted as part of the expanded Superfund assessment, revealed PCB concentrations in the garden soil at levels significantly above residential safety standards. The garden that residents had built as an act of hope on land they had reclaimed and cultivated carefully for 15 years was contaminated. The vegetables they had grown, the food they had fed their children, had been produced in soil that a federal agency now classified as too contaminated for gardening. The garden was closed. The soil was remediated. The community that had built it experienced something that cannot be adequately described as property damage or health risk, or even betrayal. It was the specific anguish of discovering that an act of care and hope and community had been unknowingly conducted inside a consequence of someone else's greed that had been there before they arrived and that no one had told them about. The Vietnamese documentation of Agent Orange's third-generation effects began appearing in peer-reviewed literature in the 2010s. Researchers studying families in heavily sprayed provinces found elevated rates of specific birth defects and developmental disabilities in children born to parents who were themselves born after the war ended. The proposed mechanism involves epigenetic modification, heritable changes in gene expression caused by dioxin exposure in the original affected generation, passed to subsequent generations through alterations in how DNA is read and expressed, rather than in the DNA sequence itself. The science of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance in humans is still developing. The evidence in Vietnamese populations is not yet definitive by the standards that would be required to establish legal causation, but the pattern is consistent, and it is consistent with mechanisms documented in animal studies conducted with dioxin compounds identical to those in Monsanto's Agent Orange. Children are being born in Vietnam today with disabilities that trace through their family history to a grandfather's exposure to a chemical manufactured in St. Louis in reactors that were run to hot to meet military production quotas faster. The legal accountability for these children is essentially zero. The Vietnamese government has pursued diplomatic and legal channels for decades with limited results. American courts have consistently held that sovereign immunity and the government contractor defense shield the manufacturers from liability to foreign nationals. For products supplied under military contract, the children themselves have no mechanism for redress. They inherit consequences with no path to accountability, no legal standing, no settlement framework, no recognition that what happened to them happened because of a decision made by a specific company for a specific financial reason that can be documented in archived procurement records, in reactor temperature logs, in internal memos about production quotas. The documentation exists. The accountability does not. There is a specific type of photograph that appears in the archives of environmental litigation and in the files of public health researchers who have worked in contaminated communities. It shows a child, usually between 5 and 10 years old, playing in a yard or walking down a street or sitting on a front porch in a neighborhood adjacent to a former industrial site. The photograph is taken before the contamination is public knowledge, before the testing, before the lawsuit, before the hazmat suits appear. The child in the photograph does not know the parents of the child in the photograph, do not know the neighbors, do not know. The contamination is invisible. It is in the soil beneath the child's feet. It is in the dust that settles on surfaces throughout the house. It is in the air that carries microscopic particles from disturbed soil. It is accumulating in the child's body in amounts that will not produce visible symptoms for decades, if ever. The photograph documents an ordinary afternoon in a neighborhood inside a catastrophe that will not become visible as a catastrophe for another 20 or 30 years. Monsanto's archives contain the equivalent of those photographs, internal documents from the 1950s and 1960s recording contamination data from neighborhoods surrounding their plants while the neighborhoods in question remained unaware. The documents and the photographs exist in parallel, separated by the wall of corporate non-disclosure that the company maintained for decades, and that the lawsuits finally began to breach after the contamination had been accumulating for an entire generation. The reckoning for Monsanto arrived in stages spread across 60 years, to slowly to feel like justice and to completely to be ignored. The PCB ban in 1976, the first Agent Orange settlement. In 1984, the Anison verdict. In 2003, the Monsanto Papers disclosure into 017. The Roundup verdicts beginning in 2018, the Bayer settlement framework in 2020. Each stage forced a partial accounting. None of them constituted the full accounting. That the scale of the harm would require the full accounting would include the workers who died before any settlement was reached, the Vietnamese civilians who received nothing, the Inuit communities in the Arctic whose traditional food sources were contaminated by chemicals that traveled thousands of miles from the source, the children born with birth defects in every community adjacent to every contaminated site, who were never included in any settlement class because their injuries could not be specifically attributed to a specific exposure with sufficient legal precision. The full accounting would also include the decades of delayed regulation, that the lobbying operation purchased the academic research that was corrupted by industry, funding designed to produce predetermined conclusions, the regulatory submissions that omitted unfavorable data, the scientists whose careers were damaged for publishing findings. The company wanted suppressed. None of these appear in the settlement. Totals, none of them can be adequately quantified. They are the invisible portion of the cost. The portion that was paid by people who had no standing in any courtroom, and no claim in any settlement, and no name in any legal document, and no connection to any of it except the misfortune of living in a world where the consequences of Monsanto's choices traveled further than Monsanto's accountability ever reached. John Francis Queeny died in November 1933 at the age of 74. He was described in his obituary as a self-made industrialist who had transformed American chemical manufacturing and created thousands of jobs in a city that honored him for. His son Edgar died in 1968. The executives who decided in 1949 to continue PCB production, despite the evidence of their own scientists, are dead. The executives who ran the Agent Orange reactors to hot-to-meet military quotas are dead. The lobbyists who spent the 1970s arguing that the PCB science was incomplete are dead. The communications official who wrote the memo about managing community concerns in Anniston is dead. None of them faced criminal charges. None of them faced personal financial liability. None of them were required to stand in any of the communities they contaminated and explain to the people who lived there what had been done and why, and how the decision had been made and who had made it and what they had known. And when they had known it, they made their decisions, collected their compensation, retired or died, and left the consequences to the soil and the water and the bodies and the children and the lawsuits and the cleanups and the communities that are still living inside. What they chose to do decades after the last person who chose it is gone. The Monsanto plant on the north side of St. Louis was demolished in stages between 2019 and 2020 to the brick and steel and concrete were removed. The contaminated soil beneath the foundation was excavated. The site was fenced and designated for remediation under the Superfund program that was itself created partly in response to contamination that Monsanto and companies like it had created. The EPA projects that the site will require active remediation for 30 to 50 years to reach standards considered acceptable for future use. That projection extends to somewhere between 2050 and 2070, more than a century after the contamination began. In the neighborhoods surrounding the former site, houses that were purchased by families in the 1950s and 1960s who were attracted by the industrial wages the plant provided are now worth less than the cost of remediating the soil beneath them. The economic damage of the contamination layered on top of the economic damage of losing the industrial employer has produced a poverty that does not have a single cause and does not have a single remedy and does not appear in any of the settlement totals because it cannot be directly attributed with legal precision to any specific act of contamination. It is simply there, the accumulated consequence of being the neighborhood where a company decided to locate its most toxic operations because the land was cheap and the residents had limited political power and the regulations were easier to manage in a community where no one had the resources to challenge them. There is a neighborhood in North St. Louis where children still do not play in the dirt, not because the company is still there. It has been gone for decades, not because the contamination is still at its peak. The cleanup has reduced it, not because anyone is still making decisions that are actively making things worse. The decisions stopped being made when the plant closed. The children do not play in the dirt because the dirt still contains what was put into it by a company that calculated that the profits were worth it and was never required by any court or any regulatory agency or any mechanism of accountability that American law provides to stand in this neighborhood and answer for that calculation to the people who are still living inside it. The soil remembers what the company has been allowed to forget. The water table holds what the ledgers never recorded. The bodies of the people who lived here carry what no settlement has fully compensated and what no cleanup has fully removed. Some things outlast the institutions that created them. Some consequences travel further than any accountability can follow. Some harms become part of the place itself, part of the ground, part of the water, part of the inherited biology of people who had no connection to the original decision except the geography of where they were born. That is the final accounting of what Monsanto chose to do, not the lawsuits, not the settlements, not the regulatory history, not even the demolished buildings. The final accounting is the neighborhood and the soil and the children and the distance between what was done and what was ever paid for it, which is not a distance that can be measured in dollars or closed by any transaction that has yet been proposed.